Let me call to order the Mayor Commission Budget Work Session. Today is July 19th, and the time is 10 a.m. And we will proceed right to the discussion. Item 1, fiscal year 21 general funded budget review and fiscal year 22 outlook. Ms. Johnson.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, members of the commission, staff, in attendance. Hopefully everyone had a good weekend. So what I'm going to do this morning as part of this presentation, cover two main perspectives. One is to give the board a review of our FY21 general fund budget development, which is the current budget that we're in. We're nearing the tail end of it, but I wanted to put it into context, the challenges that we met in developing a balanced budget for this fiscal year, and then to give the board an outlook of what the general fund looks like as we look at the final throes of developing a balanced budget for fiscal year 22. So, for the review of the FY21 general fund, I don't want it to get lost on us that we developed a balanced budget for this year in the midst of an unprecedented budget challenge, which was we were in the midst of a global pandemic recession, and there were various market changes that took place that affected the development of the budget. Before we developed the budget, and I think this point perhaps got lost in translation, but I want to underscore it because from my perspective and for the health of our budget, I think it's critically important that it does not get lost on us. Before the budget balancing process began, we looked at our past budget practice as it relates to the vacancy allowance methodology that had been utilized. And in looking at where we were at the point of budgets being submitted, we had a $4.2 million vacancy allowance that had been built into how we budget in the general fund. And that allowance basically consists of looking at all of the approved positions by the commission, calculating or projecting the length of time positions would be vacant, and then doing a pro rata reduction of the appropriated amount, and then balance the budget on that. That, while it is a common practice among municipalities from time to time, what it does is on the back end, when you go into the ensuing year to balance the budget, to then fully fund the positions, you start out with that vacancy allowance amount that needs to be made up. And knowing that we were going to have a challenging budget year ahead of us, the directors were directed to balance their budget by reducing the $4.2 million rounded for talking purposes so that they would come in with a balanced budget and we would not increase the budget automatically out the gate. So before we started with the challenges of balancing the budget due to the pandemic and other market changes, budgets had been reduced by $4.2 million. That was a structural change in how we budget for the general fund. On top of that, when we looked at where we ended up at the end of the day in our base operating budget, and you're going to hear that term from time to time, that base operating budget does not take into consideration one-time grant money that we get. It does not take into consideration carry-forward dollars. Your base operating budget is the amount of funds you have each year to balance your general expenses. So for this year's budget, we had a base operating revenue increase of $2 million plus. Our base operating expenditures in terms of the increase was the $9.9 million, and sometime you heard us refer to that as $10 million. And therein lies the delta between those two was the crux of the challenge that we dealt with balancing the budget. We had an operating gap or deficit, if you will, in our budget for FY21 of $7.9 million, $8 million for talking purposes. So when we looked at some of the high-level summary of how we got to where we were, we started out with an operating revenue increase of $9 million plus, as is indicated on your screen. That $9 million was comprised of net property taxes. We had an increase in our values of 8.1%. That translated into $7,713,765 in additional tax revenue. From the other revenue sources where we saw an increase for this year's budget, they are identified there on your screen. There were 5 other sources that had various amount of increases, and that totaled the $1.4 million rounded. That brought us to the $9 million plus in operating revenue on the front end. However, because of the pandemic and the changes in certain market items, we experienced a revenue loss in the general fund of $7,099,357,000. And the categories that are listed on the screen breaks out what that $7 million loss consisted of. And I want to highlight here, as it relates to the state revenue sharing, that's where we took some of the big hits. When you look at the half-cent sales tax, we lost almost $2 million, $1.9 million in revenue. In franchise fees, another big hit of approximately $1.3 million. When you look at business taxes, $1 million, but that's reflective of what the country and certainly the city experienced with the shutdowns because of the global pandemic. So we took a $7 million revenue loss and other revenue streams that fund the general fund. When you look at the increase of the $9 million and net that out with the decrease of what we lost, that's how we ended up with a net operating revenue increase or change of an additional $2 million. So if I move on to the other side of the equation, and one of the things that I have consistently said in my discussions with the board as well as with the staff, you cannot look at the general fund budget from just one set of lens, and that is the revenue. We do very well given the makeup of our city and the interest in the city, but we also have to have a balanced perspective, and that is on the expenditure side. And this is not the side that perhaps is as popular to have to zero in on, but however, you have to balance your budget with revenues and expenditures. So when we look at the expenditure side of our operating budget, we had increases in our base operations. And these are normal increases that you see annually. I want to highlight the fact that as you look down the list, this list does not include new requests. It's not comprised of a wish list from departments. These are obligations that the city was required to finance. So when you look at the total of the obligated increases in your base budget, that was the $9.9 million or the $10 million rounded. So again, just by way of a high-level wrap-up, for this year's budget development, again, we started out making a structural budget change with reducing budgets to allow for positions to be fully funded in this year's budget of the $4.2 million. When we look at where we ended up with the net revenue increase, of $2 million, then based on the increase in the operating budget for expenditures of $9.9 million, again, the major challenge we had this year was trying to close that gap of 7.9 or $8 million. And how did we do that? We did it in a number of ways. There were a number of different strategies. Before I go into the strategies, I want to highlight that there were certain items that we knew given the deficit that we had, that we just absolutely could not undertake in the operating budget unless there were going to be across-the-board massive layoffs, which there was just no support for that. We identified one-time equipment and infrastructure needs of about $4.7 million. What we indicated to the board was that we will look at those items from unassigned fund balance, and you're going to hear a discussion on that later in the work session. We also knew that we were going to have rising overtime demands for both police and fire. On the police side, it related to the continuation of the ongoing protests that we were experiencing in the city. And on fire side, it related to managing and responding to the pandemic that really increased the need for overtime on that side. At that time, we were in the midst of negotiations with both. At that time, it was PBA on the police side, and that later changed to FOP, and then with fire, IAFF. We knew that we were going to have a future budget impact, given that we were looking at market adjustments that were going to be on the table that would not be finalized by the time that the budget had to be adopted. The plan was that we would come back to the board with some options on how we can fund whatever the end result of those negotiations were, but that it would be a budget reduction that would require a budget amendment. So as we look at the strategies that were utilized to help close that deficit that we experienced in budget and balancing this year's budget, we had significant cuts in material and services. And that consisted of the various items that are listed on the screen. Travel was cut back to the bone, as well as training, memberships, professional services. We cut back operating supplies and equipment, capital outlay, small capital outlay was not funded. We took out the normal $1 million that we fund for contingency. We cut out the education reimbursement that we normally provide to our employees to continue their education. The budget did not include COLAs for your management one level employees, which would be the directors up to my level. It did not include COLAs for management two employees, and it did not include COLAs for your confidential employees. Departments were not allowed to have any new budget requests that were considered because of the dire situation of the general fund. In addition, we after much discussion and debate, we ended up with the 5% across the board personnel service reductions in all of the general fund departments with the exception of police and fire. At the end of the day, that 5% reduction resulted in 43 funded positions being cut out of the budget. We reduced the man hours for the library and parks and recreation, and then we also cut temporary services that department had in their budgets prior to FY21. We also, in an effort to not have to then go into cutting field positions, we looked at where we could shift expenses out of the general fund budget to relieve some additional burden and shift it into other funds. That was done in three particular areas. We shifted the cost of 6 public works employees to the gas tax fund for the tune of about $433,000. On the fire side, we shifted expenses of about $304,000, and that related to a position and benefits into the fire assessment fund. And then on the police side, police got a grant for 28, maybe 30 additional positions. And rather than funding all of those positions or bringing all those positions online, we took half of those of the existing positions in the general fund, shifted those to the grant with the intent that those additional positions would come back into the general fund budget in fiscal year 22. And I want to make certain that that does not get lost on us, because as we look down the road at the FY24 general fund budget, that $1,085,000 for those 15 positions will come off the top of wherever we are with the general fund, because we have a legal obligation to fund those positions out of the general fund. So if you look at that $1.8 million in shift that we were able to do, if we had not shifted those various items out of the general fund, we would have had to make reductions of an additional $1.8 million. And based on where we were at that time, that would have resulted in layoffs, because we just had cut essentially everything else out of the budget. So at the end of the day, the board did adopt, as is required by law, a balanced budget for FY21, the current budget year that we're in. And as part of that adopted budget, it maintained the current millage rate of 8.3465. It included all of the city's obligated expenditures. We preserved the existing programs and services. It preserved the current workforce in that we did not have massive layoffs. We did not have massive furloughs. We didn't have a layoff of a full-time city employee. I think there was one part-time employee that was laid off at the end of the day. We were able to include the 3% COLAs for SEIU and PMSA, as well as the 5% step pay for then PBA, now FOP, and as well as IAFF. So we did balance the budget at the end of the day. Our general fund operating budget to the tune of $193,470,640. So that base budget is where we start now with fiscal year 22. So as we look at what our situation looks like for FY22, the picture has certainly improved over what we went through for this year. So as we look at our property taxes, we have the property tax based on what the property appraiser gave us for the final values July 1st. We have growth in our values of 6.66%, which translate, and I use the rounded numbers, $5.3 million of additional property tax revenue for the general fund. And we look at all of the various other sources that are listed there before you. We are estimating an additional $5.4 million from those various sources that fund the general fund. So that gives us, starting out, approximately $10.7 million of new revenue to fund the general fund, compared to where we were for this year with a deficit of almost $8 million. So it is a much better picture that we're dealing with for FY22. However, again, as I've continued to point out, we have to look at the other side of the equation. You know, with our operating expenditures, based on the estimates that we're looking at right now, we're estimating an increase of about $14.2 million of new operational expenses coming into the general fund budget for FY22. And that comprised by categories. We have market mandates, and those are things that relate to the health insurance and items along that line of about $1.5 million. Our personnel expenses continue to rise at about $3.2 million, which is the norm when you look at municipal government. We have identified in terms of the step costs, and that would be for SEIU and PMSA that we are looking to build into the operating budget, the COLA and then VIVA of about $3.7 million, as well as providing for the police and fire market adjustments for FY22 of about $5.8 million. And the market adjustment for police and fire, for police, that builds in the amount related to the agreement that has been executed now at this point. And with fire, that amount relates to the tentative agreement that was signed back in late May, I believe it was. In addition, we have some other pending threshold issues that we're still working through and will be finalizing here within the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And with one of these, we will not have it finalized for certain, and that is we have union negotiations that are going on right now with SEIU and PMSA. As the board may or may not recall, with SEIU and PMSA, what we negotiated for the new contract was a 3-year deal that only included a 1 year on the financial, which was that 3% COLA, with the understanding that in the ensuing 2 years, FY '22 and '23, we would come back to the table to negotiate what that would be, or if it would consist of a COLA at all. So we have started the negotiations with both unions. The board is aware that the police captains have been given the approval through PERC to unionize. They are still completing that process, so we have not yet sat at the negotiation table, but that would be an impact for FY '22. Moving on, we do have some vehicle replacement and purchases that we've not been able to dial into the budget. That's going to continue to be a challenge with how we fund our vehicle replacements and then new purchases. We're still going to be grappling with how we're going to be able to fund police and fire overtime, given the fact that in both budgets, for police, in the operating budget was $2.2 million, and for fire, their operating budget included $2.7 million for overtime. In an effort to negotiate a deal for the market adjustment, the only area that we had available to us to be able to negotiate the contracts was using the overtime. So the $2.2 million for police is what was the lion's share that funded the executed agreement, and the $2.7 million for fire is what is being utilized to fund the tentative agreement. So that $2.2 million for police is no longer dialed into the operating budget, nor is the $2.7 million for fire dialed into the operating budget. However, we know that there is going to be overtime with both areas. It certainly should not be overtime at the level that we've seen it in the past, because each operation will now be in a position to overcome some of the recruitment challenges we experienced because of where we were in the market, and then being able to fully fund the positions and recruit the vacant positions. We are presuming that that is going to significantly reduce the overtime that we've experienced. And certainly we have to still identify what would be the appropriate amount of overtime to budget, something less than what we've had, and then how do we fund that? Another area that we're still grappling with is what do we do about our confidential employees, Management 2 and Management 1. Would we be in a position to put the 3% COLA in the budget? I will tell you, as the city administrator, to the greatest extent possible, I am looking to include the 3% for at least confidential and Management 2 within the budget. Just looking at what we're beginning to experience with the HR director, we have been tracking on a monthly basis the turnover in non-public safety operations. And we're at a very high number between October 1 and as I speak to you regarding this issue. The vast majority, I wouldn't say vast majority, at least half of the positions were employees offered an exit interview. What they told us was that, you know, they just were able to get a higher salary by going somewhere else, because now we are behind the market on the non-public safety side of the equation. If you look back to what the city experienced during the economic recession of 2008, our employees on the non-public safety side went 5 years without a COLA, and we've never done a catch-up. And it's at a point now where it's really beginning to adversely affect the department's ability to be able to manage an increased workload with reduced staff. So we have to look at how do we begin to at least try to address some of the lag in their salaries as well. So again, to the greatest extent possible. For starters, I'm looking at including a COLA for the confidential employees, management two, and then last, and hopefully we'll be able to include a COLA for management one as well as part of the balanced budget. But we have to look at where the final numbers fall out. So by just looking at it, the two fiscal years together, this fiscal year FY21 and the FY22 outlook, just by way of a wrap-up, our base operating net revenue, you saw for this year, $2 million plus. We're looking at an estimate of $10.7 million for FY22. When you look at our base operating expenditures, how they are trending upward for this fiscal year, $9.9 million, $14.2 million estimated for FY22. And now that dials in the market adjustment, so that accounts for why you see that significant delta between the 9.9 and the 14.2. And then when you look at how does that net, where does that fall? So the base operating budget gap for this year, again, the $7.9 million or $8 million for talking purposes, compared to an estimated $3.5 million for FY22, but for the impact that we may experience coming out of negotiations with the various unions and the other costs that we're able to address as part of FY22 budget. So where do we go from here? In terms of next steps, what is dialed into the schedule is that on July 28th and 29th, we have the community Zoom budget meeting scheduled. One meeting is in the morning, the other meeting is in the afternoon. And then moving from there, we have confirmed 2 additional work session dates, given just the number of items that we have on the schedule. So August 5th, we're looking at bringing a discussion to the board on the Fire Assessment Fund as well as the American Rescue Funds. Moving on then to August 11th, we're looking at a budget work session where the board will get the proposed FY22 balanced budget as well as a presentation on the capital improvement program. Then on August 23rd, the board will get a presentation on your preliminary FY22 balanced budget, your fire assessment rate final hearing, as well as the chronic nuisance assessment final hearing. And then at the City Commission meeting, as is required by statute, in September, you will have the first public hearing on the adoption of the FY22 tentative balanced budget and the millage rate. And then that will be followed by a second public hearing for adoption of the final FY22 balanced budget and millage rate. And with that, I will open it up for board discussions and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Administrator Johnson, for a very thorough presentation. And I'm glad that you took us back about a year ago when we were confronting the budget for this year, reminded us of the steep hill that we had to climb. Sometimes time dulls our memory, and those were some very challenging times, and I'm glad that under your leadership we were able to overcome those. And it looks like we still have some challenges for the year going forward, and I'm confident that we too will be able to overcome. Questions from commissioners? Commissioner Lambert and Commissioner Peduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have a couple of questions, but happy to have you come back to me for all of them. But thank you, Administrator Johnson, for this review, and I agree. I appreciate the review of this year's budget and the challenges that we had. And that's my first question as it relates to, as you now have been through this process from beginning and now closing out and starting over again on this year, we didn't fill a lot of positions that were vacant. And then, as you mentioned, we looked at the 5% decrease across the board of all of our departments. I'm curious, when we talked about doing that, we also talked about looking at efficiencies within our departments. And so I'm curious as to if you could speak to what efficiencies we implemented. Is our services being impacted by those cuts, so that we're looking at, do those need to be replaced as we move forward? I mean, I know you mentioned the COLA for confidential and management employees, but are there other areas that we need to be looking at as well?
In terms of operational efficiencies, we did not implement per se an across-the-board methodology for efficiencies within operations. You know, that's very challenging to do because each operation is unique in and of itself. What we did experience is that department directors looked at their individual operation and identified what changes could be made so that they could become more efficient in how they operated. You have to take that into context of what was happening last year. We were pretty much in a virtual world, so we began to really operate, with Zoom meetings and conference calls and what have you, as opposed to the normal way of operating. I think we saw significant changes in how the library operates, and was still able to maintain services even in the midst of the pandemic. You saw that as well as in housing and community development. Development services really went from an in-person service model to really doing it through drop boxes and then perhaps doing it on Zoom meetings. So we changed to accommodate the transition that all municipalities were in. I think there were some tweaks within operations in terms of procedures, taking a look at procedures where procedures perhaps were too cumbersome, or if we could streamline them. We did those, so those were small measures that when you take them all together, made an impact. In terms of still being able to deliver the service, I think that's something that the board and the city, and certainly me as the city administrator, can be very proud of, and that is that from my perspective, we did a yeoman's job with keeping the city running. I mean, we kept permits going out of the door, and as a result of that, you see where the construction, has continued. You're seeing the increase in the permit revenue. I think all of those projections have been exceeded because we were able to keep, even though the doors of City Hall technically were closed to the public, the city operation and business continued. And I think we did very well and are continuing to do very well. But I will underscore that it is not without an impact or a strain. When you change how you are operating on the backs of an already strained staff, there's going to be an impact. So where we had employees out doing remote work, that was another challenge. The departments were already at reduced staffing level before we got dealt this major challenge that we were dealing with. And they have really juggled a lot of balls, to keep everything going, and I think they have done an excellent job with that.
Thank you. And, I certainly want to make sure that our departments and our staff have the resources that they need, but I would be interested to see any post-pandemic analysis or review that department heads have done to say, because of this, we have now implemented this new procedure, whether it's a virtual or a Dropbox, that number one is still able to meet or exceed the needs of our residents and stakeholders, but that also, that we're able to be more efficient. I think of that phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, and we certainly invented and worked hard through this pandemic. So I'm just curious, what of those things can we take moving forward, be efficient? I'd love to see that. Thank you.
President Peduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'm by no means a financial guru, so this may be an obvious question, but I just want to understand where we are. So that 5% across the board that Commissioner Lambert was talking about, that we took cuts, as an example, in the commission department, we cut, a lot of our supplies and training and education travel, those type things. Have those, in the numbers that you showed us, already been restored, or are those reflective of those 5% cuts that we took last year, the numbers that you're carrying forward today? I mean, are we starting off already 5% down, or were they already restored in those numbers?
Commissioner Peduzzi, no, your understanding is correct. You're starting out at a 5% reduction for FY22.
Okay.
And so when you take that into context with the guidelines to reduce your adopted budget, which was 5% less than the FY20 budget, and reduce that by 5%. So we're still in the budget reduction phase. But none of the 5% reductions were restored. That was your base budget.
Commissioner Warren.
Thank you very much. When we look at the projections for overtime, and we exclude the impact of the pandemic, what is being factored into the formula for the projections for the upcoming fiscal year?
For FY22, we have not yet looked at what factors are going to come into play with determining the amount of what will be budgeted for overtime. That's why that's deemed as a pending threshold issue. Now, what the Chief Adderley and Chief Maddie are doing, is looking at their staffing patterns based on now being fully staffed, what kind of reduction that will have on the overtime. So that will address perhaps the overtime that was tied to the protests, which, as we stand right now, have seemed to have died down, as well as the overtime that was tied to the pandemic. However, there are other reasons for overtime. So then you look at what are some of the other factors that will cause overtime. Even when you're full staff, looking at perhaps, let's say, for example, and I'm qualifying this for example, if you look at your amount of sick time or call-ins for sick, and then what does that do in terms of particularly with fire? So if you got a high rate where, for various reasons, people or members within the bargaining unit are calling in sick, you have to then staff that because you have to have a certain number of firefighters on each vehicle or engine or what have you. And then, so how much of that overtime relates to that? They are going through that exercise, and at the end of the day, in fact, we already have a meeting teed up for this afternoon with the mayor at the table. We're going to begin that discussion of what methodology we can put in place to identify what are the driving factors that are causing the overtime, to taper up, given that we should now be in a position where we're addressing being fully staffed, having all of the positions filled, what that reduction would be, what the other factors are, and then what that cost potentially would look like, and what is it that we can do proactively to control those costs. And then we have to back into what a dollar amount will be, depending on what the budget can sustain.
Do we also consider special events and where there are people that are hiring officers to perform special events? Does that come out of this, and is that offset by the end user?
When for special events, and if I'm inaccurately articulating this, someone from staff, please correct me. But for special events, the organizers usually will reimburse for the cost. for having police and fire there. So while it may be a cost to the city, that's a cost that we get reimbursed for. We don't do special events for an organizer, and then, that's a gift that we give them. They're doing the event. So that is a cost that they will pick up. The overtime that's in the budget is the overtime that relates to actions that the city or events that the city itself has to provide, public safety, whether it's police and fire. When you're talking about the protests, you're not going to have an organizer that's going to, cover that. We have to make certain that the public is safe, so we have to incur that overtime for police to make certain that those are orderly, and if anything should happen, they can address it.
Commissioner Schoaf, and then Commissioner Fox.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation, Administrator Johnson. I wanted to kind of take a look at the whole financial picture. I know the city is slated to receive American Recovery Plan Act funds, understanding those cannot take the place of operational needs. Is there opportunities within our budget where maybe we were going to take something on as an operational expense that can now be capitalized, that gets taken care of by another fund such as the American Recovery Plan, so that we can kind of diminish that gap and then essentially harden our infrastructure or, transfer those costs into other areas?
And I'm thinking through here in terms of the operating budget. I don't know of a particular area within the operating budget where that can be done, simply because of the fact that your operating budget is the ongoing expenses. Now, if you look at the pending threshold issues, where we had vehicle replacements, and if there are one-time capital needs that are identified when we go through the capital improvement program, those would be areas that we could identify potentially for American Rescue Funds. But we have to make certain that we are very mindful that those are one-time dollars and then that they have to be used for certain things. But that would be an example where we could use it. So if we were to dial, and I think going through the budget reviews, we identified perhaps of about 11 million in vehicle needs that have just not been addressed. Those are one-time capital purchases. So as an example, theoretically, that would be appropriate to consider from American Rescue funding.
Sure, and certainly those are the examples. I know at one point we looked at a gate that we were constantly repairing and shifting from taking that ongoing operational cost into a capital cost. And certainly during 2008, I know from our fleet management perspective, new vehicles were not able to be purchased, and there was a lot of capital equipment that now is reaching well beyond its useful life. So to the extent that we can shift cost of ongoing maintenance for those failing assets into a capitalized place, certainly would be supportive of trying to make sure that we're addressing those needs and freeing up dollars within the operational budget to address some of that deficit.
I agree, Commissioner Scho, but I need to just underscore that it would not be freeing it up because we're not in a position where it was included in the budget. So I just want to make certain that that is clear. What it would do is that it will give us the ability to now fund it, but it wouldn't free up anything in your operating budget because we simply have not been in a position to include it in the operating budget.
So I'll further clarify. I think my gate example is one that we've gone through in the past where there was operational dollars to maintain a gate to an area, perhaps out west. I can't remember the specifics of it. So that was included in the ongoing operational budget to repair or to maintain that gate. And at one point we shifted that where we said a full gate replacement would be better served. So that was a capital budget item. So instead of allocating those dollars to repairing that item, we shifted is not the right word. We allocated dollars out of a capital budget versus ongoing maintenance. So my question is, as we're looking at this budget and what has been funded operationally, are there those opportunities to say what makes more sense is to purchase a new capital purchase, which would qualify under another account, versus taking on the ongoing operational expenses of any particular item?
There are not very many, if any, opportunities. As it relate to the specific example that you mentioned, what we did was that with the gate situation, we were funding the cost of having security there at the complex, and that was at a pretty big clip. When we looked at what it would cost to just repair the gate, it was more cost-effective to just repair it than to keep an operational cost in there to provide the security for the complex rather than having the gate, which would accomplish the same thing. So what we did as part of this year's budget, we backed out the long-term ongoing operational costs for security and funded the replacement of the gates. That's already in this year's budget. So that is not dialed in for FY22 because effectively we resolved the problem this year.
Sure, and thank you, and I appreciate that, just using that as an example, if there were any of those opportunities, certainly I think this year might be the year where we have different sources of revenue coming into the city that those things could be addressed.
I want to assure you that we are looking at the budget with a fine-tooth comb, and if we're in a position to identify where legally we can do that, we certainly will do it. One of the things that you can't do with the American Rescue Funds is that you can't supplant general fund expenses with the American Rescue Fund. So we have to make certain that legally we're doing what the law requires, so we don't put the city in a position where we take our eye off of the requirements, and then there's that clawback where down the road we now are facing a repayment of it. But we're looking at every opportunity to use the American Rescue Funds as is legally permissible.
Thank you.
And we're going to be having a work session on that with more specific proposals for the use of those funds, right?
Yes, sir.
On August 5th. Commissioner Fox.
Thank you. My question also pertained to the American Rescue Fund, but I guess I know that we're going to be speaking about this on August 5th, and I appreciate that we will have more detailed discussion about it. But I guess just generally, I remember from the PowerPoint you sent us about some of the list of items that could be used. I believe there were things like first responders, repayment from overtime during COVID and things like that. So I think we have infrastructure needs that maybe we already had, but could they not be moved from, the general fund, instead of using those funds, just using them instead from this fund? I guess I'm just looking at some of the things that we've just gone through, for example, the first responder overtime, and I believe that was something that was in the package you sent us, so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, again, to where costs are legally permissible to fund under the American Rescue Funds, we will do. Even if it turns out to be the overtime for police and fire. As it relates to infrastructure, because infrastructure is not dialed into the general fund operating budget, it would not be replacing anything that's already in the budget, but where infrastructure is permissible under the American Rescue Funds, we know we have a host of infrastructure needs within the city, and those are the kinds of discussion that we will be bringing to the board. So we will lay out in great detail what is permissible under the plan, and then what our needs are, what has been proposed or recommended by the city, directors, not city, the directors, vetted with the mayor, and then the board will have that opportunity to have input on it.
Okay, any other questions on this portion of the agenda? Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you. So obviously our property taxes, we'll get that amount from the property tax collector's office. But what about tracking and projecting what our revenues are going to be for the city? How often are we updating that projection, and how are we realizing that?
Finance does a good job with, projecting where our property tax revenue and all of the general fund revenue sources will be. What we have to keep in mind, that was a very challenging thing to do, given the pandemic. It was really hard to project how the economy was going to come back. Where property taxes, we really don't have to take the lead on trying to project that because you have the property appraiser doing that. However, I will tell you through development services, Rick Green does a good job with tracking, new constructions and then what that impact is going to be on the tax base. So we always have a pretty good idea of what kind of growth we're seeing in the city. But we really rely on the property appraiser to give us those numbers. As we look at the other sources, we'll be able to get back on track, hopefully, depending on where the country ends up here now that we are grappling with this Delta variant, how the economy is coming back. While we are seeing that a number of the revenue streams have come back over where we were going into the development of this year's budget, not all of them are at the level pre-COVID. So we still have some room to increase revenue streams back to the level they were before COVID hit. We seem to be on the uptick, but we're not yet where we were before then. From my perspective, the biggest challenge that we have with not having to annually be in a situation where we're doing budget reductions is somehow getting, a handle on expenditures. Because irregardless of the growth in revenues, if our expenditures continue to outpace the revenues, we are going to be in a perpetual budget reduction mode. And we're talking about just the operating base budget. We're not talking about new requests. And I know a number of departments have items that they have been looking to get for some years now that just can't be considered. And when you look at vehicle replacements, we've not been able to budget that for a number of years. So that's, from my perspective, our biggest challenge is how do we grapple and manage that?
Thank you, and I'm glad you brought up expenses. I did have one question on when you talked about the fiscal year 2022, our increased operating obligations. It said $3 million as an increase in personnel. And what makes up that $3 million? Is that insurance increases, obligations?
The insurance increases would be as part of the market mandates. The increases in personnel would be your increases in benefits. You got a cost that goes up every year with that. If you dial in costs related to VIVA, there's an increase with that. You have pension costs that go up every year, so it's those normal personnel expenses that just trend up every year.
Thank you. And I do have one question about these budget workshops before I get to that. One thing that I think as we worked through this process last year, and it was all of our first time working together with you on this, and I think some direction. You mentioned a number of times that you were moving in the direction that was given to you by the commission, and sometimes, I don't know if that direction was given in one-on-one meetings or in a meeting like this, but sometimes it wasn't necessarily in line with what I thought my direction was. And so I was curious if maybe there's a way that moving forward this year, we can be clear on what that direction is before we get to a presentation point where it's just a check-in that we say, hey, this is the direction that we're moving in for working on the budget, just a level set for everybody so there's no question about it.
Point well taken, Commissioner Lambert. And I think that, with me coming into the position of city administrator and not having the benefit of having worked with the commissioners, you all were getting accustomed to my style and I'm getting accustomed to your style. But as it relates to how I couch direction from the commission, if ever you feel that I am inaccurately couching direction that you all have given, I would ask and insist that you correct me on that on the spot. You don't have to be concerned whether or not it's going to put a bad taste in my mouth. As a professional manager, I always try to accurately articulate what I felt I got from the commission. And here's where I think the gap in communication comes in. You know, when I present, we had maybe 11 work sessions with the commission, and as part of the work sessions, there were slides that indicated, you know, board endorsement of X, Y, and Z. So if, as a consensus of the board, I didn't hear any objection to not go in that direction, I take it to mean the board is on board with this. So if the board does not articulate to me, Ms. Johnson, I don't endorse this methodology, I don't agree with the direction that you have proposed, then it leaves me to operate on the premise that in the alternative, the board is okay with it. So, and while there may be in certain instances where there is a consensus, being 3 of the commissioners who may have nodded or didn't object, I always understand that there could be 1 or 2 commissioners who do not agree with it, but I have to operate on what I think is the consensus direction from the board, and I can never put together a budget or any plan that's going to hit on all cylinders from 5 commissioners. I just can't meet that standard.
That's fair enough, and I really appreciate that, and I think that, you know, I've always operated under the premise of transparent communication and being very open, so I appreciate your response to that and look forward to that continuing as we move forward through this process. On the topic of transparency, as it relates to the budget work sessions, thank you so much for moving one of them to the evening. I know that that was a request that we had a few months ago. I also, as I've been sharing these with the community, had 2 questions bubble up. One was, since they are being done virtually, will people who want to show up in person have the opportunity to show up in person to be able to interact with the presentation? And whether they're in person or online, will there be opportunity for them to engage, ask questions, and participate in the workshop? That's the community workshop.
We will take that into consideration. I think in the past where we've had Zoom meetings, we've made provisions in either Flagler Gallery or perhaps in one of the conference rooms where if we had members of the public who wanted to come and be in person. So we will take those 2 points into consideration.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to move on because we have 2 other items on the agenda. And before we go, can you turn back 1 slide? I think it's slide 20, I want to see. Okay, so in summary, as I read this, we've got about $3.5 million gap that we got to fill over the course of the next few weeks in terms of the budget, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we had that note. Okay, so item 2, also from you, at least to tee it up, Administrator Johnson, use of discretionary unassigned fund balance discussion. And let me say before we begin this, I may have to leave before we complete this across the hall. We're fortunate enough to be hosting with Congresswoman Franco, the U.S. Secretary of Labor. We'll be meeting with some mayors across the hall beginning at 11:45, so I may have to leave here, but you'll be in capable hands with President Baduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to do a quick overview to put this into context for the board in terms of the 2 presentations you're going to hear. So if we look back at Mr. Park's presentation to the board on July 7th, the fund balance update, the bottom line summary that Mr. Parks presented, and this was the fund balance at the end of fiscal year 20. We had $16.6 million in emergency reserves as is required. Then we had the required minimum unassigned fund balance of $5 million. Did I hit something? Sorry about that. And then we had the 5.6 in discretionary fund balance. which is what is available for the board to consider some of the one-time items we were not able to fund in this year's budget. So when we look at what the board has already approved, at the June 14th meeting, the board approved the $279,000 for the police vehicle leases and rentals. You approved the $96,210 for the clerk's office to cover the cost of the vote by mail ballots. That left $5,256,171 in available discretionary unassigned fund balance. And what you are going to hear momentarily is a presentation on funding for City Hall ceiling of $832,000 and police vehicle replacement of $1.6 million. Subject to the support and approval of those two items, that would leave remaining unassigned discretionary fund balance of about $2.8 million. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Guzman is going to do, I think, the first presentation. I need to get out of. Mario, you can come on up and pull yours up.
All right, thank you. Good morning, Commissioners, Mayor James.
Good morning.
Colleagues and members of the public. Overview of the presentation. Going to go over the history, our current status, and the future. As you can see, the history, talk about the building age, past concerns, some of the repairs we have done, currently, some of the steps we have taken, and the future, the report findings, recommended action plan, and the implications of deferring repairs.
Mr. Guzman, can you speak closer to the mic, please? So we can,
Better?
much better.
All right.
Thank you.
So a little history. The structure is 15 years old. Even though we moved in 2009, keep in mind the structure when it was built, City Hall. So it's roughly 15 years old. We're experiencing numerous service calls after heavy rainfall from the northern section of the city campus, and that is, including the library, and depending on how much rainfall we have, that's kind of dictates the service calls. It's affecting from the 5th floor to the 1st floor. Departments such as finance, IT, HR, administration, and development services. The facilities team, from when we started to track work orders, when we implemented a new system, we have 30 work orders that are dedicated strictly to the leakage from August 2018 to December 2020. The carpet pretty much gets just wet. We have to come in with fans. So as my says here, the team comes in, dries it up, seals conduits, whatever we can visibly see that needs to be repaired, we'll do it there. And depending when the rainfall is, in some instances, we had to vacate the working area of individuals in order to dry that office. So definitely causing a disruption in services and a loss of productivity. Current situation. I just wanted to note that our roof is still under the warranty. That roof gets certified every 2 years. We have a company come out from Canada, and they inspect the roof and certify it. We've conducted mold tests throughout City Hall, and they all came back negative. I didn't do too good in chemistry, but I'm gonna try to pronounce this. Penicillium was found on the 2nd floor administration area, and it was sanitized by an outside vendor. And I just wanna note, no air is pure clean. There's always contaminants in the air. It's depending how high those levels get. In this particular case, the levels were still below the EPA recommendations, but as a proactive measure, we decided to have that sanitized by an outside company. Once again, sanitizing that 2nd floor administration area was a disruption to staff. They could no longer be there, and that was about a 1.5-day process. So after seeing these sporadic leaks over this time, we try to do it internally. We called some contractors. We finally contracted with an engineering firm in 2020 to analyze and assess the leaks at City Hall. The report found numerous seal points and a recommended action plan. And I don't know if I mentioned it, though, even though we started tracking things from 2018, there has been, calls here and there in 2017, 2016 regarding leak issues. So this is a picture from the report. What I want to show you guys, look how many different services we have here. We have the concrete, we have the stone, we have the windows. Those are all areas that have to be sealed. What they'll do is they'll come in, this will get bid out, it'll get pressure washed, and apply specific caulking and also water repellent on the stone. Once again, I just want to identify the different contact points. You have glass, you have metal for the window, the conduit where the light is. Those are all the areas that are going to be cleaned and sealed. That's a close-up. So basically, for this particular situation, it's removing that caulking you see on the left-hand side, raise the stone, reseal it with water repellent, and also seal the window area where you see the metal where it's buttoned up. So pretty much everywhere there's a contact point, be it cement, stone, and metal, is where we're going to be sealing. We're going to go out to bid to seal for City Hall. Just some more pictures of the contact areas. You can see how you have some areas where it's open. Pretty self-explanatory. That's throughout the building. We're seeing that. So the engineering report, what were the findings? As I stated earlier, numerous points of contacts that need to be sealing. Typically on commercial sealants, they last anywhere from 15 to 20 years. What we're experiencing is a premature failure of that sealant. The existing leaks are sporadic, but they will increase over time. The recommendation from the engineering report, targeted caulking at identified contact points, complete sealing of the structure, clean, remove existing caulking, repair stones, level stones, and apply repellent. According to the engineering report, this would put the structure to a new status and could last anywhere from 15 to 20 years to be leak-proof. Estimated budget, $832,000. The true cost will be on the solicitation, so hopefully the construction market dies down a little bit and we can see even better costs. The engineering firm will be, they provided the scope, and they will be assisting us in the evaluation. I'm going to discuss some of the implications of deferring the maintenance. Definitely increased maintenance costs as the team has to come in and dry the carpets. In some cases, they might have to replace the carpets. We're going to be compromising the structural integrity as water is finding its way into City Hall. Damage to carpet, electrical, walls, and anything involved in building maintenance. And also to increase the potential of microbial growth. Questions? Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. And Ms. Johnson, you may be the better one to answer for this. Are we considering some kind of maintenance fund for this building? It's nice to spend $832,000 to get it sealed. That seems to will last for 15 or 20 years or whatever the time period is, but wisdom says we need to start setting money aside every year to place into some kind of maintenance fund. This building's not going to get any younger. Is that part of discussions going forward? I know it's a wish list, but we can't shy away from that obligation.
Mayor, it is part of discussions that we have had, but in terms of actively being able to include funding in the proposed budget that the board is going to see here early August, I don't contemplate that you're going to see that in there just because of the gap that we, still have to close. But again, that will be a discussion after the board hears the proposed budget. You want to move things around to do that, that would be an option.
Well, even if it isn't the next budget year, let's keep it on the radar for the year after that. It may be aspirational, but it's necessary. It may not, and obviously not just for this building. We need to do an assessment of all of our buildings and start setting money aside for maintenance of these buildings so that we're not stuck with these bills.
So noted.
All right. Any questions for Mr. Goossman? Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I think to some of my earlier comments with the administrator, I'm supportive of, kind of doing these one-time capital outlays, because as you've expressed here, we're looking at not only ongoing bills of remediation, but also disruption of staff, which has an intangible cost. So I think it's really smart of us to try to get ahead of this, seal up, get watertight, and avoid those ongoing disruptions and expenses. So thanks for bringing this forward.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you
Thanks, everyone.
very much. Do you want to tee something up, Ms. Johnson, or we go straight to, I don't see Chief Morris here.
I'm just.
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Captain Andrew Clark. Recently been assigned to admin services at the police department. I'm joined today with Sergeant Ray Shaw. He's our logistics supervisor, and on the day-to-day, he takes care of our police fleet. So he's here to answer any particular questions. So today we're here, we'll give you some information on our current needs for FY 2021. We'll go through the vehicle replacement and additions estimate, what the purchasing process is and what it actually takes to build a marked police vehicle currently. An emphasis.
Let's see. I normally don't let staff delegate up.
How do you scroll through? Okay. Most importantly, if anything, is to discuss the purchasing timeline of police vehicles. So we'll go through a detailed inventory of the 2021 vehicle order estimate. We have some preliminary information for the 22 vehicle estimate. And we'll go back and do a historical for the previous and current budgets as it's related to vehicle purchases. And lastly, I'll make a comment about the maintenance and fuel charges. So currently in our fleet, we have approximately 372 vehicles, 173 marked, 117 unmarked, and 82 specialty vehicles. That could be anything from a boat to motorcycles to ATVs and things that we use for special operations. For fiscal 2021, we have 15 vehicles that meet the standards to be serviced out through the current FOP, formerly PBA contract. And there's 2 criteria that those vehicles will fall under. This is the language in the contract, and it really comes down to 2 things. It goes to 8 years or 140,000 miles for a marked police vehicle. That's the standard criteria that's being used. And so with that said, this is an itemized list of the specific vehicles that we'll have to take out of the fleet this year by contract, and this will be by age. As I said, there was 15. There's 13 on the detailed list. 2 have been lost from traffic crashes. So the 2 at the bottom here, number 5 and 6, that totals the 15. And of course, we have 4 additional ones that were total loss. One point I'd like to make about that is when we suffer a loss throughout the year for a vehicle due to whatever circumstances, mainly wrecks, we only get a fraction back for the replacement cost of that vehicle. So if a brand new vehicle's wrecked or whatever, it's obviously prorated down based on age or mileage. So I think this year we had like 6 vehicles that were lost, and the funds that were recouped basically only paid to replace 1 vehicle. Administrator Johnson touched on the grant position, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But initially, when we applied for the grant for the officers, we used a number of $50,000 per vehicle that was estimated in the cost analysis to take on those officers. Those will be coming online. We've broken that up through fiscal year 21, 22, and 23. We're looking at adding 10 additional vehicles for 21, 15 for 22, and 5 respectively for 23. And that's just sort of a breakdown of it. The importance here is, of course, how we're going to break those vehicle needs up. And again, it's 10 for 21. Going into 22, it would be a additional 15, and 23 would be 5. How do we buy a vehicle? We use a standardized Sheriff's Web or Sheriff's state contract. We found that that's the most feasible and cost prudent to buy the vehicle. Going forward, we're looking to replace our marked vehicles with Chevy Tahoes, 2-wheel drive. And considerations for vehicle selection were based on, but not limited to, the initial purchase price of the vehicle compared to other comparable models that do the similar job, gas mileage, preventative maintenance costs, and resale value when we take the vehicles out of service on monies we recruit. So what does it take to build a police vehicle? First, we purchase the vehicle through the state contract. We're given a selection of dealers in our area, which is the southern area, and we typically go and almost exclusively go with the lowest bidder. We'll put the purchase order out for those vehicles, acquire the base vehicle. Because we're building a police vehicle, it requires additional equipment from the dealer. So this will be the option list that is required for us to make it into a police car. Then we have to build the vehicle out. We use Dana Safety Supply for that, for a total build out cost to actually physically make it into a vehicle with lights, sirens, cages, all the things that make it a police vehicle, for a cost of $14,621 per vehicle. So there is a difference between a new vehicle addition to our fleet and replacing a vehicle. If we're replacing a vehicle, some of the equipment in the vehicle being taken out of service can be reutilized. We'll take that equipment out and replace that into a new vehicle. That would be considered a replacement vehicle. Some of the things we can reutilize would be a police radio, which has about a $5,000 expense. So there is a price, that would be the price difference between a new vehicle versus a replacement vehicle. Obviously, if it's a new vehicle, we don't have this equipment, we would have to order that stuff, and that is an additional cost. In modern policing, a police vehicle now is basically an office on wheels. It has a lot of electronics in it. We share and create, transmit, and receive a lot of electronic data from the vehicles. So that requires basically a router in the car that allows us to do all the things that we do in modern policing. That has an additional cost of about $2,700, $2,800. So that comes down to a total cost to build a police vehicle. going forward. So you have if it's a new addition to the fleet, you have a cost of about $57,172 for a vehicle that would include a new police radio. If we're replacing a vehicle, again, we can take that police radio out, put it in the new vehicle for a cost of $52,257. The note here is very important. It takes approximately 12 to 14 months from the time you submit a purchase order to the time a vehicle goes into service. So we're always trying to play catch up with this if we ever order behind the timeline. So what we're here today discussing for FY 2021, that order in a perfect world obviously would have been placed in September of 20 and would just now be coming online. So as we get close to FY 2022, that'll have to be a discussion hopefully in the very near future, because we'll run up against basically the same thing moving forward. We'll be a year out. It takes a long time, obviously, to get these things in service. And as we acquire all these new police officers, it'll be difficult to catch up with the fleet. We do have one additional requirement or need for 21. We have community service aides who basically, for the most part, they handle traffic crashes in the busiest part of the days. That's an unsworn position, so the guidelines in the contract don't apply to this vehicle. There is a need for one. We don't build it out quite as extensively as a patrol vehicle. So we can utilize a little bit cheaper of a vehicle for that. In this case, it's a Dodge Charger, only because it doesn't require a cage and other things like that that require more safety items. So again, it's the same process. We use the same state contracts, and we use the same vendors to build the vehicles. In this case, a vehicle for this purpose, if you're including an addition to the fleet, it's $41,800, and then if we're doing a replacement, it's $36,800. Sergeant Shaw has come up with a pretty innovative solution to try to save some money on this. On a temporary basis, we can utilize an existing police vehicle that normally we would take out of service and utilize that as a CSA vehicle. We can do a conversion on that for a cost savings of it would only cost us about $2,000 in the short term to do that. But again, that is just a temporary fix. Eventually, this vehicle would have to be taken out of service just because maintenance costs and service life. So if we went this route to convert an existing vehicle for a CSA option, you're just extending that. So whether it's 22, 23, this vehicle would have to be factored in at that time. Just to reiterate, so far we've lost 6 vehicles for a total replacement cost of about $313,000. And again, what we get back from risk management is a fraction of that cost. So total FY 2021, our needs are 19 replacement vehicles, 10 additions to our fleet, and the one at the bottom would be a CSA vehicle, and there is an option, as I just said, to convert one, so we could do a little bit of cost savings there. So we're looking at roughly about a $1.6 million need for 2021. I do have some information. I think we want to keep this to 2021, but if anybody would require or like to see, we will have additional costs for 2022. 2022 will have some needs for some more specialized vehicles, so there'll be a bit of an increased cost, and the items needed for the grant positions, there'll be a few more of those. Just to take a look back historically at our budgets for police vehicles, in 2018, our fleet was managed by the city's fleet. There was $5.3 million allocated at that time in 2018. The 2019 number is monies carried over from 2018, so that's not new monies. The 3.2 million, that's was carried over from 18. In 2020, the 137,000 was debt service that was also carried over from the initial 2018. I believe it was for some vehicle leases options that they did back in 2018. In 2020, a resolution was passed for 615,000, and that's the only amount of new funds that we've had to purchase 15 vehicles for 2020. And of course, today we're here discussing 2021, which we have not had monies budgeted for that. I just wanted to kind of take a victory lap here while we have the opportunity and just point out that since the police department has taken over the actual day-to-day fleet maintenance and fueling for our vehicles, Sergeant Shaw deserves a lot of credit for that. We've saved the city approximately $500,000 each year since we've taken it over.
Thank you for that presentation. Couple questions. A while back, when I was a commissioner, we had several of the police vehicles that experienced some engine problems. There's speculation as to reasons, faulty gas or whatever, and I think there was a lawsuit. Do we recover anything in connection with that? And was that able to be used to either replace those vehicles, repair them? Can somebody give me the update, please?
The last I was told that we haven't received any money from that yet.
All right, Jose Luis, you're walking up. Is that, you have information on that?
Good morning, Commissioners, Mr. Mayor. We haven't received that reimbursement yet, but that reimbursement is going to be very minimal. It's not going to cover anywhere the cost of replacing the vehicles. What we did do when we did get the new engines on those vehicles that had the damaged engines is that we made an amendment to the collective bargaining agreement. So those vehicles are going to be taken out of that 8-year, $140,000 mile replacement range. And those vehicles are going to be allowed under the new engines to rack up, additional miles because obviously, although they may be 8 years old, they have a brand new engine. So those vehicles won't be replaced as recently as they would have had the engines not been replaced. But yeah, whatever we recover is going to be minimal compared to the cost.
Thank you. That leads to my second question. Have we done a cost-benefit analysis with respect to our insurance policy to see if we can get either, I'm sure it'll be more in premiums, but if we could get a higher amount of reimbursement when a vehicle was totaled? It just seems, and I don't know if we've run those numbers, obviously with the increased premium, justify that or not.
I don't believe we've done that analysis because the way that our policy is structured, and I will research that just to make sure that I can update you. The way that our policies work is just we have the standard vehicle policy, so it works the same way as our policies for our personal vehicles or any other commercial vehicle would work, which is that when the vehicle is damaged or it's totaled, they're going to give you whatever that blue book value is in replacement. I don't think that there's the ability to pay a higher premium to get a higher rate of reimbursement. They'll just reimburse whatever the blue book value of it is.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions? Commissioner Schoaf. Commissioner Fox and President, okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. Certainly, I think having equipment for the police department is one of the highest priorities, and I'm glad to see that we're looking at phasing things in over time, and I think that was, I had the same question as the mayor referring to our insurance, and it's good to know that those vehicles will keep on going. So as we look down the line, I think where, I guess, my questions lie, you have a lead time of about a year. So the idea is to get ahead of these and start to replace, because I think being in a place where we're replacing 46 of our cars, that's a good percentage of the entire fleet, to which that only kicks it down the line another 8 years before you're buying 46 vehicles again. So I guess as you've kind of taken this over, looking at the entire picture, have we looked down the line to say, does it make sense to shift a few more cars a year, or, try to build up so that we don't end up hitting that 46 vehicle bump somewhere down the road again? And maybe the number's 46, maybe the number's 50 down the road, but just to space those out, because I know, again, during that 2008 period, we were at a loss of vehicle replacements. So I'd imagine that was part of that road bump of 46. But have we looked from a holistic standpoint to make sure that we're budgeting down the line so that we're not building up that capacity?
So there's multiple factors that go into it. The biggest hurdle would be if there's any delay in doing 1 year's order, that creates the snowball effect down the line. So that is probably the biggest obstacle. We can anticipate how many vehicles we'll need based on the contract language. The vehicles that we lose to, for whatever reason, we can't really anticipate, although we can give you a number that is probably an average of what is probably going to get wrecked, so we can sort of anticipate that. And then the only other thing that is sort of the outlier is specialized vehicles. They obviously don't come up as much, so sometimes that's a little harder to determine. But really, I think the solution would be, and I know these are trying times, if there's some fixed number that we can commit to that's in the budget going forward every year that we know we can order X amount of cars from. But really the biggest hurdle is once you delay, because again, the lead times are so long, and given the only other factor is if a decision is made to increase our police staff, so if we go from 320 to 350, that has to be factored in as well. And if that's done anywhere outside of the budgeting process, then we would take on that additional expense as well. So it's kind of hard to determine.
Got it. And
because our operating is so fluid based on our personnel.
If you had that multi-year commitment, would that be helpful in a procurement environment, or you're already under state contract, so you're part of a group purchasing plan anyway? Would it be helpful if there was any kind of commitment down the line in negotiating a multi-year agreement versus a one-year agreement?
Yeah, the contract doesn't change per se. I mean, the monies might change a little bit, but yes, I think it would be helpful if there was some type of commitment in the budget for that.
Understood. Thank you.
Commissioner Fox and Commissioner Peduzzi.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm very supportive of you having the equipment you need and also the building maintenance. So I think my question is more for Administrator Johnson. I'm just curious if you could remind us of what the unassigned fund balance can be used for. I know in one of the early slides it said if we commit to these two items, there would be $2.8 million left in this fund. And one of your slides said for 2022, you were looking for possibly $2.4 million for additional cars. So I'm not sure if you can just let us know a little bit more about what this fund can be paid for, whether it is, putting it towards these cars going forward or some of the deficits that we're looking at. I'm just curious if you can just let us know a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yes. Commissioner Fox, given that it's discretionary, unassigned fund balance, it can be used for any of the general fund operational expenses. Fund balance typically is used for one-time capital purchases. So in terms of the remaining $2.8 million that you would have left, could it be used for the $2.4 million that they would need for FY22? The answer is yes. And not that the board needs to operate on my recommendation, but I would recommend that you not make that call at this point, because we are still finalizing where we're going to end up with FY21 budget, and there may be a need to use a portion, if not all of that 2.8 million, depending on where we end up with the overtime. The overtime right now is trending higher than what is budgeted, so we may need it for that, or it may be some other things. So I would just ask that if that is the pleasure of the board, that you wait until we at least get to the end of this fiscal year and look at where we are, and then have that discussion on how you want to use that 2.8 million, would be my recommendation.
All right, President Peduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question about take-home versus line vehicles. We know there's plenty of studies out there that show that take-home vehicles tend to last a lot longer for a number of reasons. How are our vehicles utilized? And then I have another follow-up question after that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
How are our vehicles currently utilized? Do we have vehicles that are line vehicles that are used shift after shift, or are vehicles used as take-home vehicles by our officers who live in the area?
So there's two types of officers. Basically, you have probationary officers and officers that have met probation. Typically, we do try to utilize the take-home program. We can't do that in all cases, but we do try to do that because for the sustainability and the life cycle of the vehicle, it is in almost every study shown that it will out-survive basically what we call a hot-seated car, where a guy pulls in, they get out, they take their stuff out, somebody else gets in. Those cars just do not last because they just drive them into the ground. So we do try to do that, and optically it might not look like you're saving money, but it certainly is in the long run. So we do try to use that, with the exception of the probationary officers, I think, unless they live in the city. So once they make probation, that's typically about a year to year and a half, we try to assign them a vehicle to sustain our fleet.
Thank you. Just brief follow-up. With regard to, I know that traditionally police departments have used gasoline engines, but police vehicles are often driven very hard, as you know, and just the demands that are placed on them. Have there been any studies? Has anyone looked at utilizing hybrid or e-vehicles? You know, because I would think that you could get the same or much better performance without driving it as hard, and maybe those vehicles would last significantly longer. I don't know if have we looked into that before, for the long term anyway?
For admin type purposes or like a patrol type function?
Patrol.
I'm not aware of that. Perhaps Sergeant Shaw could speak to that. I do know in the past that we bought some sedans for administrative and unmarked plainclothes purposes. I myself drive one. They're very expensive to fix when they do break. You know, batteries, $8,000-9,000 just for a battery. But Sergeant Shaw might be able to speak to it.
Ford's probably the biggest one pushing their hybrid utility right now.
Talking to the Mac, because we're taping, Mike, we're taping.
I'm sorry. Ford's probably the biggest one pushing their hybrid utility right now, which we did T&E a while back. We brought one into the police department. The guys did like it. Unfortunately, it's $7,000 more than a Tahoe is. So when you add that $7,000 just onto the price of each and every vehicle, it's kind of hard to push that to you guys. I got to come and ask for $2 million instead of 1.6. It also, we have a Chevy Volt that's at the dealership right now, and it's $8,600 to fix it. So those costs just, to me, aren't effective.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you so much. This was very helpful in understanding the resources that are needed for our residents, business owners, and guests. I'm curious if you can share with us a little bit more about the breakdown of the take-home vehicles versus vehicles that are used for other staff. Do we have detailed numbers on those so we can get a better understanding of where and how these vehicles are being used?
I don't have those exact numbers, but I'd be more than happy to put that together and send it to you. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Shove.
Thank you, Mayor. My question, I think, more is for you, Administrator Johnson. I'm certainly very supportive of getting very much needed equipment to the police department. And if we're looking at unassigned fund balance this year, certainly something to consider. But as we can see from the fund balances, that's not a maintainable strategy going forward. Being that these are union negotiated requirements, did we have a contingency plan of some other fund source to fund these from, knowing that they'll come down the line and knowing that they're going to come down the line in the future?
Commissioner Schoaf, at this point, we do not. That is something that, again, is on the discussion table. You know, there are just a number of items that we need to start doing contingency planning for, but for last year, where we were, we just have not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's something really important to consider. We know things are coming down the line, and just by the numbers, it's not sustainable to continue to use unassigned fund balance, not to mention, to your point, some of the other things that may have to come from unassigned fund balance. So certainly supportive in any way we can be helpful to identify additional sources of revenue to look at this in the future.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. You've laid out the situation in very stark terms. Thank you. Jose Luis, Mr. Rodriguez.
Good morning again, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners. My presentation today is going to be focused on giving you a brief update on some position reallocations that Human Resources, in conjunction with the affected departments, are going to be recommending to you for consideration at an upcoming board meeting. Along those lines, I'm going to give you an overview of how the reallocation process works, and then go department by department on some of the reallocations that we are proposing and why we're proposing those reallocations, and then we'll be open to any questions or comments that you all may have. In summary, the Human Resources Department regularly conducts position classification reviews. That includes looking at, and this is always done in conjunction with the specific departments that those positions report to. And this is looking at job descriptions, the titles, we call them job classifications, but that's interchangeable with job titles, and the position's pay grades. When there's operational needs of a department that warrant an update, i.e., which we call a reallocation of specific job classifications and their pay grades, we bring those updates to the commission, and those updates are approved as part of what we call our salary plan for the year. And these updates are done at 2 points in the year. They're done as part of the overall budget approval process, where we submit a salary plan for the entire range of positions in the city. But then periodically, we may bring these items to the board when operational needs of a department change, so that you can consider it at that time as well. So with that review that we've done recently, HR and the police, housing, community development, public works, finance, information technology, my department, HR, and the mayor's office are proposing reallocation of certain positions in order to ensure that the functions of those positions are properly aligned with the operational needs that those departments need. We are looking to place these reallocations that I'm going to go into detail now on the August 9th consent agenda, as we've done for previous these types of changes. And I also want to clarify that these are just changes in job titles or changes in the pay grades associated to the job titles. They are not additions of positions to the city's FTE count. So we are not adding an FTE count or having that type of budgetary impact. It's just basically making sure that the positions match what the operational needs are for those positions. So the first department that we will briefly discuss is Public Works. And Public Works is seeking to reallocate 2 Public Works Technician 4 positions to 2 positions of lead Public Work technicians. What that will do is that it'll allow the career progression program to be implemented for that department. As you will recall, we have earlier had commission approval for other positions in the city that have different levels, and as employees gain experience, or certifications, they're able to progress, for example, from a utilities maintenance worker 1 to a maintenance worker 2 to a maintenance worker 3. That's called a career progression. So this will add that level of career progression to the Public Works Department, and it'll also, by making it a lead position, allow for the opportunity for internal candidates to be able to grow into a position that has supervisory functions and skills, and that'll also achieve the ability of the department to have that position as a lead that can supervise and guide the other positions in the department. And that's the only change being proposed for Public Works. In the Finance Department, we have numerous classification reallocations based on the current needs of the Finance Department. We are proposing to reallocate a senior accountant position to a treasury supervisor position, the reallocation of 2 cashier positions to 2 accounting clerk positions, the reallocation of an accountant position to a senior accountant position, the reallocation of a collection specialist to an accountant position. And these reallocations are being proposed because after a review of the assigned tasks of the departments, there have been new requirements that the Finance Department has had for expanded uses of database and administering financial databases, enhanced financial reporting, tracking requirements. And that's why these changes are being recommended, to ensure that those positions that are highlighted above in the first part of the slide have the job duties that correspond to what functions we actually need those positions to perform in the Finance Department. In the Information Technology Department, the department is asking to reallocate a senior accounting clerk to a fiscal analyst position, and that is to align the position to what the job functions are. The needed job functions and current job functions of that position are really that of a fiscal analyst, not an accounting clerk. So this will simply update that job classification title to match what the current and ongoing needs and functions of that position are. In the Human Resources Department, we are proposing to reallocate a training and development specialist position to that of a senior administrative assistant. Currently, the Human Resources Department doesn't have a senior administrative assistant position like other departments do. So by reallocating this position to that function, the basic administrative functions of the departments will be able to be carried out by that position. In Housing and Community Development, we are proposing a reallocation of the Community Development Programs Administrator to that of a Housing and Community Development Programs Manager. And this will enable the department to have that supervisory function. That position was in the department, and it was mislabeled as part of the FY21 budget. So this will update it to the proper title and function of what that position should be. And in the Police Department, we are proposing a reallocation of the Police Administrative Services Coordinator position, that is a civilian position, to that of a Public Information Officer position. And we currently had an officer that served as both an officer and a PIO for the department, but that officer has retired. And in reviewing the needs of the position and the expanded role that Public Information is having with police-related functions, Chief Adderley and HR and administration concluded that reclassifying a civilian position to serve as a PIO is operationally more efficient and will better meet the expanded needs of the department for a PIO. And the final change that we're proposing is a reallocation of the pay grade of the Chief of Staff position from a pay grade 64, which is the range is listed there, to a pay grade 73. The reason why we're proposing this reallocation is because in fiscal year 21, the responsibility of the Chief of Staff position and the Economic Development Manager position were combined into one position, having an expanded roles and responsibility that cover both jobs. But the salary grade for the position was not updated at that time. So given the expanded responsibilities, the appropriate pay grade for that position should be that of the Economic Development Manager at a grade 73, because as mentioned, that position is really doing two jobs in one. They're doing all of the duties of the Chief of Staff and the Economic Development Manager. And so with that, those are the summary of the reclassifications that we will be placing on the consent agenda for August 9th, and I'm open to any questions or discussion that you have on this item.
Thank you. Questions from commissioners? For Mr. Rodriguez? Oh, sorry, Commissioner Shove.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Just so that I make sure I understand, anything that we're recommending here today is not a difference besides the last one we just went over of kind of the combination of positions, but it is a reallocation of an already established position to an elevated position, and sometimes there's an associated pay adjustment with that. Sometimes it's just a change in title. Is that correct?
Correct. For most of these, it's basically just reallocating the functions of the position. Some of them are vacant. So, for example, the Housing and Community Development position is vacant, so I wouldn't be able to speak as to the pay for that position. But for the other ones, it's just reallocating the job title. It's not increasing the FTE or having that type of budgetary impact.
Okay, that was my other question too. Some positions are vacant, some are occupied. And so those who are in occupied positions are aware of these changes
Yes.
that would occur to
Yes,
their
it'll
positions.
IT is an example, for example, that's a fiscal analyst, the fiscal analyst versus the accountant position, that function's already being performed, and this is just updating the title to match the functions that are being performed.
Okay, and if I might, Commission President, I just have one more follow-up.
Sure.
As to the Chief of Staff position and the Economic Development Director, can you refresh me, when we went through the last budget iteration, I didn't recall the Chief of Staff position being within the last budget. Is that just something that I missed? That was approved as a position in our last fiscal year?
What happened was that the Economic Development Manager position was advertised, was underfilled as a Chief of Staff, and the duties were combined because the Chief of Staff job title and job description was more accurate. But then the Economic Development Manager responsibilities were also kept as part of the position. So it was basically a merger of the two positions rather than recruiting a Chief of Staff and then also recruiting an Economic Development Manager.
Sure, and I know what resulted. I guess my question still goes back to, I don't recall a Chief of Staff position being advertised in the budget. Am I missing it, Administrator?
You are not missing it, Commissioner Sho. The Chief of Staff position was always in the city's salary plan. So when you look at the change in the mayors, the former mayor, as I understood it, had the Chief of Staff working in that capacity. Mayor James did not have anyone working in that capacity, although the position was always in the budget. And as we looked at balancing for FY 21, the funding for that position was not included in the budget. The position was in the salary plan, no funding in the budget. There was funding for the Economic Development Director, change to Economic Development Manager. Therefore, the mayor had to underfill the Economic Development Manager, which was in the salary plan and funded in the budget. He had to underfill it with the Chief of Staff, which was an approved position, but no funding. So he took the funding from the Economic Development Manager that was in the budget to underfill the Chief of Staff that was in the salary plan without dollars. So that's why you're not recalling it. You're correct.
I appreciate that clarification. I guess the question I would have as it pertains to just this particular position, being that it's now kind of a hybrid of two positions, is if we could maybe see as a board what that position job duties would be, since this is now essentially a new position, right? It's a hybrid Chief of Staff, Economic Development Director, and if we could see what the job duties were, because certainly both 100% of both jobs are not going to be able to be fulfilled by one person. So I'd imagine there's a segment of each job that will be eliminated with this this kind of new category?
Yes, and in fact, we have the new job description already developed. When when the mayor decided to do the underfilling and look at both functions being consolidated, we revised the two job descriptions and consolidated them into one so we can provide that to the commission. That is already approved.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, and the position was advertised, and that updated job description was advertised as part of the position, so.
That is correct, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Rodriguez? Okay, if no questions, thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. And we will move on to mayor's matters, and I'll ask the city administrator, Madam City Administrator, do you have anything that Mayor James needed to convey this morning?
I do not, Mr. President, and I hope he didn't leave notes that he intended to put on the record because I don't have them, but thank you very much.
I don't see anything at his seat either, so then we will move on to any other issues. Commissioner Shove.
Thank you, President Pizzuzi. I just wanted to say a big thank you to city staff, to my colleagues here on the dais, and mostly to members of the community who came out about the stop sign at Spruce and 24th Street. A huge thank you to FDOT for responding that they would look into the stop sign with a lead time of 2 to 4 weeks to make that intersection safer. So I appreciate all of the efforts of staff to help coordinate and all that you continue to do, and to the residents for coming out to be supportive. So thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner Shove. Anything else for the good of the body from the commissioners? Administration? No? Okay.
No, thank you, Board.
Thank you. Then we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 11:56. Thank you.